Girl with glasses calls on her swamp monster to intervene in the fight and attack the monster, which managed to dodge the arrow and was in the air. The swamp monster manages to spit its mud at the fire monster and thereby knocks it off its trajectory, preventing it from landing normally. The fire monster fell to the ground and could not move as the dirt stuck it to the ground. The monster with the bow prepares to attack as it understands that this is the right chance to finish off the fire monster. But the monster was not going to give up so easily and uses the barrier ability to reflect the arrows and manage to escape from the swamp trap. After being freed, the monster looked out from behind the barrier and smiled contentedly, and was angry that his opponents had such monsters that they could cause problems. Kajuro realizes that things are not going quite according to plan, and decides to use his red eye to cast a curse on the fire monster. The fire monster, seeing that a spell is being cast on it to explode, becomes very tense, since it does not have protection against curses. Kajuro, smiling, clicks his fingers to activate the curse and put an end to the damned fire monster that killed a bunch of people. After activating the third-level curse, the monster explodes, and a large column of smoke and ash from the destruction rises into the sky. After the smoke cleared, the fire monster lay on the ground and was barely alive. His condition indicated that he was defeated. While the guys were happy that they managed to cope with the fire monster, the silhouette of a man began to appear behind them and was approaching the guys. It was a strong monster that was heading towards the guys. He screamed and yelled that he would not let all the monsters that were in this morgue be killed. The guys turned around when they heard that a scary, high-level monster was approaching them from behind. The girls began to scream in fear, and thereby attracted the attention of Kazuro, who did not immediately understand what was happening. Khan says that he will deal with this monster, which approaches and begins to take out his cleaver. Meanwhile, everyone stopped controlling what was happening to the fire monster and became distracted. The fire monster came to his senses and used his power for the last time as he was severely wounded and exhausted. He releases a huge fireball. The fireball flies past the guys and thereby greatly surprises them, since they did not expect an attack from behind. It turns out that the fireball was not aimed at the guys, but at the monster that was approaching them. The monster was very surprised that he was attacked by a fire monster and began to scream. The monster is enveloped in fire and begins to burn, leaving no chance of salvation. From the intense temperature and heat of the fire, the monster screams in pain and realizes that he is dying. The monster's corpse falls to the ground after such a powerful fireball attack. All the guys were surprised that the monster attacked his brother. Kazuro turns around and sees that the fire monster was actually an elderly woman lying on the ground, badly injured. Kazuro asks her in surprise why she attacked the monster that was running to her aid. Kajuro didn't understand at all why the monsters were attacking each other. The old woman, closing her eyes, began to tell that this damned monster was her son, who did many terrible things because of his greed. The old woman said that she and her husband had a son who brought a girl into the family who became his wife. At first everything was fine, and she and her old man did not suspect anything until one day. Their son and fiancé decided to kill their parents in order to take their house and money for themselves, without waiting another 10 years for their normal death. They tied the bodies of the old woman and her husband with bandages and prepared them for cremation alive. She and her husband were very angry after they realized what their son and fiancé was capable of. Because of this, they turned into fiery monsters that wanted revenge on their offenders and killed them. Unfortunately, their greed was so strong that it turned them into monsters too. The old woman, putting her hand on her chest, said that they were stronger than their damn children, and therefore the greedy monsters began to serve the fiery ones, helping to kill people. Kazuro listened to the old woman and took out his sword, filling it with powerful power to end the woman's suffering and send her to her husband. The girl behind was very touched by the woman's story and said that she was very sorry that everything had turned out this way and was glad that it was all behind her now. Kajuro paid attention to the girl's words. Kazuro, holding the stone of the fire monster in his hand, said that he was not such a sensitive person, that he would help every monster since he was only interested in prey from monsters. Kirizawa came up and said that he remembered that he promised to give all the stones for help in destroying the monsters and saving their lives. While Kazuro was rejoicing at the large number of stones that he received for his help in destroying the monsters, Sarah appeared behind her, leaving the morgue, as if she had been awakened by the noise. Kajuro heard that Sarah came to them and asked her how she slept while they were working. He was glad to see his older friend, which gave them the opportunity to fight such opponents. While Kajuro hid the stones in his pocket, Sarah asked everyone to gather and prepare to head to their dorms, since it was already too late and not safe. Kazuro decides to ask Sarah to go to the wall of the city, where the inhabitants of his village were exiled and were expelled and settled on construction bases. Kazuro was worried that if the words of those monster girls from the pool were true, then soon all the settlements near the city would be attacked by a large number of monsters. Sarah, having listened to Kazuro's request, understood that this was very important and agreed to help Kazuro deliver him to the settlement. Everyone got ready and headed to the dorm to get to a safe place. Sarah took Kazuro and Han with her and flew to a settlement outside the city. After flying on the monster all night, the guys ended up in a settlement where people lived who had been kicked out of their settlements. The houses were like barracks and looked like life was unbearable. Kazuro and Han began their journey through a squalid settlement where houses could be destroyed with one blow. Khan was very surprised that people could live in such conditions. While the guys were walking along the streets and looking around, a little girl ran out to meet them, not looking around and playing happily. The girl did not have time to see that she was approaching the strangers and hit the guy, who did not immediately notice the little girl that was approaching. The girl stood up and saw guys in front of her who clearly looked not local. She asked who they were and why they were in their settlement. Kazuro replied that he and his friend were travelers and just got here by accident. The girl, hearing the guy's words, began to get angry that he was deceiving her and said that there was no one here except the locals and the military. Kazuro, smiling, decides to pet the girl, saying that there is no need to be afraid of them and they came to help. Kazuro was very pained that people from his home village lived here and had to suffer like this. The girl was shocked that the boy began to stroke her and blushed a little in surprise. She was pleased, but she didn't know why these guys came here. Suddenly, a boy runs out of the alley, stands in front of the little girl and starts shouting at the strangers that they have come and pestered his little sister. Kazuro replies that they are not going to interfere with them and just want to talk to the head of the town. Kajuro raised his thumb up and said that he praised the boy for protecting his little sister so ardently. The boy was very angry and a little afraid that strangers had come to the city. The children were in shabby clothes and were not warm at all. Kazuro began to calm the boy down and ask, "Where are all the adults?" All the men worked on the construction of a wall around the city, which was supposed to protect them from monsters, of which there were too many, and they could attack civilians. Many adults were ruthlessly exploited and were quite emaciated. They had to work at a construction site for pennies and do their work without delay. The man was pulling a cable to which a large stone was tied, but his cable breaks and the man falls. Everyone standing nearby notices that something very terrible has happened. A large stone began to fall directly on the man who fell from the broken cable. No one could move because they were too weak to somehow save the man. Kazuro and his monsters managed to come to the rescue in time and go to intercept a huge stone so that it does not fall on the man and ruin his life. A man and his comrades see a group of monsters grab a huge stone and throw it aside. It was very unexpected and incredible. Kajuro also lands on a stone and, standing on it, asks the man on whom the stone almost fell, "Is everything okay?" The man thought that this was their king, who disappeared decades ago or was killed. The man said with great hope and joy that this was definitely the king. The rest of the workers heard the old man's words that he called the boy who saved him king, and this inspired them. For them, it was hope that their life would get better. The military man who stood on the tower and watched the workers notices that they are shirking and just started talking instead of working, and points a weapon at them and starts shouting for them to get to work. Suddenly their captain appears behind him, stops his soldiers and tells them not to rush to do such a thing. He also heard the old man's words and said that this boy was now under the supervision of the head of the absorbers. The captain was intoxicated by the thought that he had such a chance to find out the truth and capture the guy, which would help him climb the career ladder and rise to the rank of general. Meanwhile, all the workers began to kneel and bow their heads before their king. Kazuro was confused and did not understand why he was mistaken for the king. He was perplexed and pointing his finger at himself. He was extremely surprised that the locals thought so. He began to have a lot of thoughts, and the fact that there were a lot of strangers here could become a big problem. The captain ordered his sniper to take aim at the boy and wait for the moment to shoot if everything did not go according to plan. Kajuro jumps off the rock and asks the people to calm down and raise their heads. Kajuro understood that these people should not call him that and expose themselves to danger from the military. Kajuro, standing straight and pointing at himself, begins to say that he is not their king at all and he is too young for such a position. He just came to deliver information from the city. Kazuro knelt down and told the man that he had definitely made a mistake, and Kazuro was not a king at all. He is a scavenger who has come to tell about the onslaught of monsters that should soon come to this settlement. The man was very weak, and there was no longer any emotion on his face. Hearing the boy's words, he said that they still had nowhere to run, so it was better to meet death here. Kazuro felt that these people would not be able to cope and would most likely die from so many monsters. So many weak and defenseless people need protection, but the state doesn't care. Kajuro began to say that he would not abandon them and would fight the monsters, but for the safety of the inhabitants, it was better to leave this land. A military man appeared behind him and wanted to hit the guy with his whip because he was interfering with work and fulfilling the plan for the day to build a protective wall. Kazuro feels that there will be a blow and grabs the whip with his hand and snatches it from the military man who wanted to do so brazenly. Kazuro tells him to get lost if he values his life. Kajuro gets up and with great dissatisfaction tells him to get out of his way and throws the whip aside. Kajuro begins to walk out into the open so everyone can see him. Kazuro, taking a deep breath into his lungs, begins to shout loudly that all residents need to leave this settlement, since monsters are heading here and will destroy everything in their path. The construction workers hear everything and begin to be distracted by the guy's words, asking everyone to leave this place and run away. The workers were very tired and understood that they would not be able to escape persecution. The captain of the guard begins to react violently to the boy's statements, which forces everyone to stop and stop working, telling everyone some nonsense about the attack on the city. Kajuro turned around, hearing the captain hysterically threatening the boy. The captain began to say that there were no monsters coming to the city, and if there were such things, they would have been warned. The captain ordered his men to surround the boy and shoot him if he continued to interfere and distract the people who were building fortifications. Suddenly, Khan starts shouting on the wall, reporting that a large number of monsters are moving towards the settlement from the northern side. This huge horde exuded a strong aura and bloodlust that everything around was covered in darkness and darkness, blocking access to the sun. The captain does not believe his eyes and begins to get very nervous and shout that this cannot happen. He orders his soldiers to retreat and leave this perimeter, returning to the city outside the walls. All the soldiers, abandoning their belongings, begin to flee and descend from the wall. Meanwhile, Kajuro begins to urge all people to listen to him and quickly leave this place. The situation is extremely dangerous, and if they don't listen to him, they will die. The captain of the guard, having descended with his soldiers, begins to run, waving his whip so that ordinary people make way and give him way, telling them not to dare to leave and to take the blow upon themselves. Kazuro begins to ask all people to quickly proceed through the gates of the city, which are still open, and to escape behind the walls. People didn't quite understand what was happening, since everything was so unexpected, but they agreed with the boy's words, after which Kajuro followed to climb the wall and hurried to Han, who was watching the monsters that were approaching the settlement. Without thinking for a long time, Kajuro begins to summon his monsters to protect the walls from the damned horde that is going to seize the territory and kill many people. The monsters approached too quickly and began to climb the walls to get to the much-desired pieces of flesh of living people. The monster with the chainsaw and the ancient warrior successfully begin to fight off the monsters that are trying to break through, climbing the walls. The monsters were getting closer and trying to break through the wall that Kajuro and his monsters were so stubbornly defending. The monsters that tried to rise unsuccessfully fell and died from the attacks of the wall's defenders. The largest monster decides to go the other way and decides to ram the wall with its body, trying to destroy it and make a passage for its fellow tribesmen. Han and Kazuro felt a strong shaking that scared them. They realized that something very bad was happening and began to look around to find the cause. Ordinary residents also felt the strong shaking and turned around to see what was happening and what caused the shaking. The huge monster managed to break through the wall and thereby made a passage for his comrades. The monsters began to enter the territory of the settlement and rejoice that everything was going as it should. Kazuro sees that the old people are not going anywhere, but are grabbing the tool and want to try to buy time for other residents to fight the monsters. Kazuro was very annoyed that everything was working out so well and understood that he was not going to throw ordinary residents on the front line to risk their lives. Kazuro asks Han to lead the old men to the wall, and in the meantime Kazuro will try to hold off the horde of monsters and kill as many damned creatures as possible. Khan tried to stop Kajuro, saying that there was no point in taking such risks, and it would be better for them to go together to accompany the residents. Kajuro objected, saying that then they wouldn't be able to leave if no one stayed. Kajuro took his blade and followed the monsters that are trying so hard to devour so many people and take over the territory for themselves. Han, a little worried, agrees to lead the people, while Kajuro holds back the monsters, but promises that as soon as he takes the residents to safety, he will return to help Kazuro. Meanwhile, Kajuro begins to summon his ghoul to summon a horde of zombies that will help in the battle and distract attention. The ghoul did not appear and feel sorry for his zombies because he understood that this risk was worth it and doing righteous deeds was very correct. The zombies begin to run out of the bag, quickly increasing to the size of a normal person. A crowd of zombies rushed to attack the monsters that broke through the wall and were moving towards the city, which they so wanted to capture and destroy many people for themselves. One of the monsters was quite strong and had a weapon. It was a huge hammer with which the monster tossed zombies around like toys. Kajuro did not waste time, and seeing how the huge monster was distracted by the zombie, decided to attack him, since he had a great threat. Without a moment's hesitation, Kajuro delivers a fatal blow to the big brute with the hammer, cutting off his head with one blow. Meanwhile, something strange was happening behind the walls. Yui was behind the wall and arguing with the head of the gate, who did not want to let ordinary residents from the settlement that built the walls into the city. Suddenly, behind the back of the military man who was in charge of the gate, Kento appeared, who did not feel any pity for ordinary residents, and told his daughter that no one would open the gate for the safety of the residents of the city of their state. Yui was very upset by her father's words and tried to convince him to let ordinary residents in because they were not to blame for anything. The head of the absorbers, Kento, did not listen to his daughter's words for long and grabbed her hand so that she would not interfere with his work and led her into the waiting room. After some time, Khan came to the gates of the city with a crowd of ordinary residents who needed salvation and help from the monsters that were attacking the city. Kento stood above the gate, who was responsible for the gate so that it did not open. Khan saw the head of the absorbers and began to shout for him to give the command to open the gates and let ordinary residents in to save them from the onslaught of a crowd of monsters. But Kento was determined not to let a single person into the city and was not going to give the command to open the gates. He didn't care about the inhabitants of the wall. Han was very surprised that the head of the scavengers was going to sacrifice so many people's lives to save the city. Kento replied that he did not care about all those who lived outside the walls, and was not going to risk the entire city for the sake of ragamuffins from the settlements whose territories they had conquered. Khan was very angry at the response of the head of the scavengers to treat people so harshly and with hatred. Khan understands that they cannot cope so easily, and will have to come up with another way to save so many residents. Meanwhile, Kazuro is fighting with all his might against a crowd of monsters that do not retreat and get in the way at every meter, wherever the boy steps. The monster with the chainsaw also fought with a bunch of monsters, and he came across a swamp opponent, which began to drag him into the swamp and block his legs. The busty beauty sees that her comrade is in trouble, and uses her musical instrument to play a melody that can stun and deprive the enemy of his movements. The swamp monster feels that a large magical net is being thrown over it, blocking its movements and strength. The monster with the chainsaw sees that he has a chance to attack such an opponent and hit him. Such a number of monsters created quite a few problems for Kajuro's monsters, but their coordinated work helped them resist a large number of monsters. On the wall was an opera singer who was fighting a fast monster that had great speed and fighting abilities. The singer received a strong blow and was immobilized, since she only had abilities that stop enemies, but does not have combat skills. The ancient warrior was also on the wall and sees how his sister was pinned down by the monster. While the warrior was distracted by the fact that his sister was being attacked, the monsters he was fighting began to attack from behind, trying to destroy the enemy that was stopping them. The warrior was taken by surprise and realized everything too late. The monsters began to attack the ancient warrior and bite him from all sides. The quick monster notices that the ancient warrior is now in captivity and will not be able to stop her from destroying the singer, who is now completely defenseless. The fast monster decides to attack the singer with a kick to throw her off balance and kill her in front of his brother. Suddenly, before the singer's eyes, the fast monster was destroyed with one quick blow of the sword, which cut the enemy. The singer already thought that this was the end of her, and was very scared. It was Kajuro, who noticed that his monsters were now in trouble, and rushed to the rescue. He, holding a mighty sword in his hands, had a lot of swordsmanship skills. Kazuro turns around and, looking at his monster, tells her to be careful because he won't always be able to cover them. The girl was glad that she was saved and asked for forgiveness, that she could not cope with the enemy. The monsters began to understand that they needed to act more coherently as in training, which forced them to become better and stronger compared to other monsters. The streamer, who was in the pool, had already filmed everything that was happening. She was happy to see Kajuro fighting so many monsters and getting her views and subscribers. What was happening was observed by the daughter of Kento, the head of Yui's absorbers, who was shocked by her father's choice and did not understand why Kajuro, who fights for ordinary people, is considered an enemy of the people. Yui had so many problems in her head and was worried that she made many mistakes and took the wrong side without knowing the whole truth. While Kajuro was fighting with a bunch of monsters, Han makes his way through the struggle and begins shouting to his comrade that everything did not go according to plan and the head of the absorbers is not going to open the gate to let people in. Han yells at Kajuro to keep fighting as they have no choice but to defeat all the monsters. Kajuro is already a little tired of hearing the words of his comrade and is very surprised, since this act spoke of the insidiousness and meanness of the head of the absorbers, that he was ready to sacrifice so many people without interfering in the battle. Kazuro looks around, assessing the number of opponents, and tries to understand how he should act and what to do to defeat so many monsters. The ghoul stood guard over people who were not allowed into the city and were trapped near the gate by monsters. Kazuro was very angry, and was not going to leave such an act of the head of the absorbers like that. He turned around and looked at Kento with the desire to kill the man who in the old days destroyed his relatives and the village. Kento stood at the gate and watched what was happening. He hoped that everything would turn out to be a victory for the monsters, and that Kajuro and many people would be killed. Kajuro was filled with anger and hatred towards Kento, and gathering all his anger into a fist, began to run towards the monsters, wanting to throw out all his anger on them by destroying his opponents. The residents who stood near the gate watched the battle of the boy who tried so hard to save them. They were sure that this boy was very similar to the boy who had once disappeared from their village after an attack by the state. People began to admire the boy's actions and were increasingly confident that this was their king who had disappeared and came to the aid of his people. They began to sing their song, which raised the morale of their hometown, where Kojuro was from. Kojuro had never heard this song, but he was pleased to hear it. It greatly improved morale and filled the body with strength and confidence in every action, forcing the body to move with great ease. Kojuro notices that he can easily destroy several high-ranking opponents with one blow, which was previously difficult for him. Kento, hearing that song, remembers how during the old battle he heard it, when he destroyed the village where all these people are from. During the battle, Han, after killing another monster, looks at the crack in the wall and notices that a new crowd of monsters is arriving, which looked much stronger than those that came first. Khan wiped his wound on his face and noticed that among the monsters that were approaching, demonic-level monsters appeared, compressing the air around them with their poisonous aura. These monsters were very strong and looked very scary. These were completely different, but very dangerous creatures that killed quite a few people after becoming so strong. Kojuro began to worry that they were too weak to withstand so many opponents and decided to make a phone call for backup. He made a video call to Sarah, who was sitting at the table having dinner. She behaved calmly, and when she saw Kazuro's nervous face, she realized that she should rush to help them. She said that she would eat and fly to them, but for now let them survive when she arrives. While Kojuro was talking with Sarah, he did not notice how 3 tall monsters approached him, which looked rather stern and had great strength. After the conversation, Sarah continued to watch the stream of the girl who was broadcasting what was happening near the city walls. Kazuro barely manages to jump away from the attack of the monster, which can spit liquid that looked very disgusting. While flying, Kazuro calls on a monster with a chainsaw to help him, and asks him to distract such a healthy beast to himself in order to fight those giants. The monster with the chainsaw heard the screams of his owner and rushed to the rescue, destroying simple monsters along the way, waving his saw. He jumps onto the shoulders of the big fat man and delivers a strong blow with his saw, cutting the monster's head with his saw. Suddenly, Kojuro notices that a strong threat is approaching him from behind. He turns around and sees a monster throwing explosives at him and laughing hard as if it gives him great pleasure. He manages to dodge the checkers that were about to explode and they fly past, approaching a large monster who notices that grenades are flying towards him. The checkers explode and blow up the large monster, thereby saving Kojuro from fighting such a strong opponent. But now another problem has appeared. The explosion hits Khan, and his comrade falls wounded to the ground. Kojuro runs up to him and grabs his hand, worrying about his partner. Kojuro asks his comrade to retreat and try to survive. Kojuro feels that many monsters are approaching them, and he understands that with the wounded Khan, they will not be able to fight and survive for long. Yui was watching what was happening, and she began to worry that Kojuro might die trying to protect people. She decides to intervene and begins to roll up her sleeve. But suddenly she is stopped by a man who with all his heart wants to stop Kojuro's plans and kill him. It was her father, Kento, who said that he would not allow his daughter to interfere in the fight and help the enemy of the state, who was trying to save people from the enemy's villages who were captured and working on the construction of the walls. Kento looked at his daughter and lowered his eyebrows and was very serious, saying that he would not allow her to help the enemy and become the culprit in the future uprising, which could happen because of the guy. Yui began shouting to her father that she could not watch ordinary people die from the inaction of the absorbers, that they were obliged to help all citizens. Kento began to look from under his forehead and began to say more intimidatingly that Kazuro was an enemy and should not be helped by a person who could become a great threat to their state. Yui was a little confused and frozen, as it became difficult for her to make the right decision after her father's words, but she felt great pity that things could become much worse if she helped Kojuro. Suddenly a man with a scar on his forehead appears on the wall who was very dissatisfied with the passivity of the absorbers and said that they are all cowards if they cannot help save ordinary people from the hands of damned monsters. This man jumps off the wall and grabs his maple tree. He is very angry that the absorbers behave so passively and are not going to interfere in the confrontation with the monsters. One of the people on the wall knows this man and was very surprised when a simple barber ran to fight the monsters without feeling any fear. He lands very coolly and immediately prepares to strike the monsters in order to get to the guys who are in trouble and now cannot fight. This hairdresser summons his shadow monster, which has great power and scatters the monsters to the sides, which helps make a corridor to the wounded guys. In the blink of an eye, the man finds himself near the guys who were surrounded by many monsters. Kojuro saw this man for the first time and did not know why he came to their aid. This warrior uses his shadow attack, which is capable of attacking many enemies around the area, which was very cool. Kazuro and Han were greatly delighted that such a strong warrior had come to their aid and had such strong abilities. He turns around and addresses Han, whom he makes fun of by saying that he needs to train more to fight so many monsters. After which, Kojuro turns to Han with admiration and asks him if he knows this man who has such fighting skills. Khan says it's his uncle. These incredible blows that leave no chance for monsters of demonic rank, who also cannot cope with such a professional. Kojuro folds his hands and shows great gratitude to Uncle Hana for coming to their aid. Uncle introduces himself as Soma and says that he's happy to help. Soma shouts to the guys that he will try to gain as much time as possible until they come to their senses and begin the battle further. Han and Kazuro were inspired and said that they were ready to show their best to defeat all the monsters. While Kojuro was happily talking to Han about his strong relative and admiring him in every possible way, some tentacles were very quickly approaching him. Kojuro manages to sense that a threat is approaching him and manages to fight back with his blade. He was angry that he was interrupted in his conversation with Khan. These damned tentacles grab the sword and envelop the entire sword to prevent the boy from fighting and disarm him. The monster begins to shackle Kazuro's body and bind him, preventing him from even moving. The boy feels that it is becoming more difficult for him to breathe and resists in every possible way. These were two monsters that had sticky tongues and the ability to enlarge their tongues. They looked very scary. Kazuro began to feel that it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to breathe and resist such a nasty monster that could act so cleverly from a distance. Suddenly, the monsters get arrows in their heads and die. It was just in time for Kojuro, and the rescue gave the boy a chance. Kazuro, clearing his throat a little and trying to come to his senses, removes the tongues from his neck that constrained his body and did not allow him to breathe. It was a monster archer whose owner was Kirizawa. He came to the rescue with his girlfriends, who saw on the stream that Kazuro was fighting with many monsters near the city. Kirizawa said that he is not as brave and strong as Kojuro and therefore is only able to help from a distance and will try to support him. Kojuro was very happy to see Kirizawa and thanked him for his help in saving him. He will be grateful if Kirizawa continues to attack from the walls and cover him in every possible way in the future battle. Kirizawa was very happy that they were grateful to him, and he began to shout to the rest of the guys that they had come to watch the fight, so that they began to help and order their monsters to attack the monsters from a distance. The guys realized that this was their chance to show everyone what they were capable of and agreed to summon their monsters to attack from a distance. Real battles began to take place on the battlefield. There were many explosions around, and thus gradually the monsters began to retreat and move away from their positions. Meanwhile, Kazuro was fighting with the enemy, and opponents began to approach behind him, who also wanted to finish off the damned boy who had killed many monsters from the army of demons who were so eager to capture the city. Suddenly, Sarah appeared in the sky, who had already arrived on the battlefield and, smiling, began to say that she apparently arrived on time and was entering the battle. Kojuro heard a familiar voice and was very happy that the strongest student from his university had come to his aid. The headless monster delivers a strong blow to the ground, causing monsters around it to fly up in a stunned state. Another monster strikes the monsters in the sky, thereby maiming or killing them. Sarah, having released her monsters into the battle, stood in the middle of the bloody battle and smiled, telling Kajuro that she and Han should go away for now and rest while she dealt with the rest of the monsters. Kajuro waved to Sarah and expressed gratitude that she had come to their aid and given them a chance to rest and patch up their wounds. Kajuro held the wounded Han, and together they walked to the gate, where ordinary residents stood who were not allowed into the city. Khan was very tired and felt that he needed to rest and was glad that so many people had come to their aid. The guys could barely walk and approached the gate, where a crowd of people was waiting for them, hoping that they would be saved. Suddenly, Khan notices a little girl running towards them. This girl was the first person they met in the settlement. She brought bottles of water for the guys who fought the monsters and tried to save all the inhabitants of the settlement. While Han drank water and tried to catch his breath, Kajuro knelt down on one knee and began to pat the little girl on the head for bringing them water. The girl behaved friendly and was glad that the guys saved so many people and her brother. The brother stood behind and began to scratch the back of his head, feeling guilty that he thought badly of the guys. Khan, after drinking water, turns his attention to the boy and asks why he doesn't like people from the city so much. The boy began to say that he and his sister ended up in this settlement because their village was destroyed by people from this city and forced to work at a construction site for pennies, which is barely enough for food. Kazuro agreed with the boy that most people in this city are very bad and treat outsiders with great hatred. The boy did not understand the city resident a little, as he looked as if he was trying to make friends. Kajuro reassured the guys by saying that he simply understood them well. Suddenly something strange began to happen on the battlefield, as if a very powerful force had appeared there, capable of defeating many absorbers. Among the many monsters that were advancing, a tornado of magical blood wind began to form, which looked very threatening. Kazuro and Han recovered a little, and seeing such a problem that could cause a lot of problems, they decide to join the battle and try to defeat the monster that has such power. Kajuro and Han decide to fight in an attempt to prevent the consequences that could harm ordinary people near the city gates. In the middle of a large bloody tornado, the silhouette of a monster began to emerge that was inside and controlled this force. Kajuro and Han tensed a little, as they had never faced such a strong opponent that was able to control such great power. Inside was a large monster with a bunch of faces on its belt, indicating its high status and strength. It was a fairly famous monster that was considered the general of monsters. Khan and Sarah realized that this was the general of the monsters and a very strong opponent. They began to worry that they would not be able to cope, and their strength was not enough to withstand such an enemy. The head of the absorbers, Kento, folded his arms when he saw such a monster, and began to think that this was a good chance to deal with Kajuro without resorting to his own actions. The warriors behind began to tense up, as they were frightened by the strength of the monster that was a general. Kento began to smile that finally an opponent had appeared that would be very difficult for Kajuro to deal with. The other soldiers did not understand why their leader was happy about such an enemy. Suddenly a strong explosion occurs, which scatters a crowd of monsters and occurs not far from the place where a crowd of opponents has gathered. Kento didn't quite understand what was happening and at first thought it was an attack by the monster general on Kajuro. Suddenly, strange people in black suits and capes began to run very quickly near the general of monsters. It was they who caused that explosion and confused many. The monster general did not immediately understand who they were and why they were running past without engaging in battle with him. The general of the monsters was very angry that those people in robes were not paying attention to him and decided to teach such arrogant warriors a lesson that they did not treat him with due fear. The monster general resorts to a ranged attack using his belt faces, which extend and attack the enemy from a distance. The robed warriors felt that they were being attacked and turned around. They hoped to break through immediately to their goal and not encounter much resistance from the monsters. But the warriors in robes did not give up the battle and began to summon their monsters to fight with the general of monsters. The summoned monsters of the robed warriors create a barrier which calmly repels the attack of the monster general, after which the monster with the ability to stretch its tentacles begins to attack the general, not at all afraid, and smiles that it will now teach the arrogant monster a lesson that dared to attack them. The tentacle monster's partner was an ice queen and uses her freezing breath to create a dense fog that blocks the monster's vision. The general monster was shocked that his body was grabbed by the monster and did not even allow him to move, and the fog had the property of weakening the enemy that came under its influence. The general could not stand it for long and falls face down, unable to move. The battle monster, which has high-level combat skills, jumped up and prepared to deliver an explosive blow to the monster general. The explosive blow was very powerful and dealt a crushing blow to the monster general, causing him to shatter into many pieces. Kajuro was shocked that those strangers were able to deal with the monster general in a few seconds, without anyone having time to understand anything. After which, Kazuro notices that a crowd of unknown people is heading towards the gate where residents from the village near the walls were located. The crowd of zombies that stood in front of the people and guarded them were a little at a loss, because they did not know how to resist such strong warriors. Kazuro was afraid that these unknown people were really heading towards ordinary residents and believed that they wanted to kill ordinary people. Kazuro manages to get ahead of the masked warriors and stands in front of them in preparation for battle, since he does not understand who they are. Unknown warriors stopped and said that they did not wish harm and wanted to take people to a safe place. Kajuro was very tense, as he was not sure that such people could be trusted. These strangers possessed powerful monsters and were able to defeat the general in a matter of seconds. The masked warriors said that they were not his enemies and wanted to save the residents from the monsters, since they would not be accepted in the city. Kazuro began to shout that he did not trust those who appeared so unexpectedly and did not even introduce themselves. Suddenly, one of the masked warriors begins to ask his comrades to make way and let him pass. Kazuro began to think that now there would be a fight with a strong opponent. This warrior begins to lower his mask and asks Kajuro to let them help save the villagers. He was very familiar to Kajuro, and this made the boy surprised. Kajuro remembered that this was the guy who was in the team with Hanami that time, near the warehouses where he was lured to rob. This warrior said that they can be trusted and they will not offend any of the residents. Kazuro, having thought everything over carefully, began to ask the soldiers in robes to take the people to a safe place. The head of the absorbers was very unhappy that some strangers wanted to take away people who were needed for construction or as cannon fodder. The head of Kento began to look from under his forehead at the strangers and say that no one would dare take his slaves. He was ready to send his warriors into battle to defeat the strangers who dared to steal their slaves. The warrior in a robe introduces himself as a member of the Shadow Clan, which has many powerful absorbers, and offers the head of Kento not to involve his people in this matter, otherwise many will die. Kento just smiled, but he noticed that all the warriors began to run away after hearing that they were facing a clan of shadows that was capable of destroying many more warriors than anyone else. Kento was very angry that his warriors were such cowards that they were afraid to engage in battle with the Shadow Clan. The soldiers began to jump off the wall and shout to their leader that their lives were more valuable than a stupid battle with warriors whose monsters were all of the highest levels. Kento was not at a loss and noticed that he had mercenaries who would not chicken out before a battle with a dangerous enemy. These warriors were simple mercenaries who carried out commands unquestioningly because the most important thing for them was money. Kento gave the order to attack, and all the mercenaries rushed into battle by jumping off the wall. They were well-trained warriors, having spent most of their lives only training. The robed warriors begin to prepare for battle and summon their monsters. Kajuro understood that if he went against the head of the absorbers, he would be mistaken for a traitor and would be persecuted until he was killed. Kajuro decides to play dumb and decides to attack the monster that appeared nearby. He grabbed his sword and started running, shouting that he was attacking. The monster was very surprised, since it was the first time he had been attacked by such a person after signing a contract with his owner. The owner of the monster saw that he was wounded and began to shout at the guy that he had attacked the wrong person. Kajuro began to act as if he was simply confused and thought that this was a simple monster of which there were plenty. He hoped he would get away with this behavior. Kazuro decides to summon his monsters, a chainsaw warrior and an ancient warrior, whom he orders to help the mercenaries in the battle, but at the same time he winks at his monsters so that they do the opposite. The monster with the chainsaw and the ancient warrior understood everything and began to rush towards their enemy, screaming as if they were aggressive. Suddenly, the monster with the chainsaw stumbles, and in its fall lands a strong blow on the monster of the mercenary, who was very disappointed that this happened. This fighter was so angry with Kajuro that he stopped controlling what was happening on the battlefield and began shouting at the guy, which he himself harmed the summoned monster and set his own stupid monsters against his own. A monster came up from behind and grabbed a man with its large mouth, only his legs dangling from his mouth. Kajuro began scratching the back of his head, as if he had done this by accident, and apologized in every possible way to the others. Kazuro also summoned a busty monster that began to play a strong chord on his zither, causing all the mercenaries to be stunned by the attack. A few minutes later, the battle with the mercenaries was already over, and all the warriors in robes remained unharmed, having not experienced any difficulties in the battle with the mercenaries. After which the performance was not finished, and it was necessary to play to the end. Kazuro begins to run towards one of the people in robes, saying that he will not forgive them for this. This warrior prepared to attack to stop the guy, and seeing that Kazuro put on a cheap show that was very hard to believe. One blow from the man in the robe knocked Kajuro out of action, and he began to fall, shouting that this was a very strong opponent. All of Kazuro's monsters were very surprised, looking at how Kazuro acted as if this was a colossal attack for him. While Kajuro was lying on the ground, he winked at his monsters so that they would also play along with him and pretend to be weakened and wounded, so that this would not allow them to continue the battle. All the monsters began to collapse, pretending that they were weak and unable to withstand such force. The opera singer and actress got so accustomed to the role that she began to scream and cry from her helplessness. Kajuro lay on the ground and barely restrained himself from laughing at the game of his monsters, but restrained himself and raised his thumb up and was glad that they played so well. Warriors in robes came closer to the residents of the settlement and said that they were not their enemies and would escort them to a place where they could continue to live in peace. The warrior who addressed the residents decided to demonstrate the symbol of their village, which disappeared on the day their city was destroyed by the cursed warriors of the state. Many old people recognized the symbol of their settlement and began to shout that they knew what it was. They realized that they had a chance to escape the control of the head of the absorbers and become free. Kajuro continued to lie on the ground and asked his ghoul to summon all the zombies into his bag so as not to interfere. The ghoul agrees and carries out his master's orders. All the zombies begin to be drawn into the ghoul's bag, which is capable of absorbing many corpses at high speed and was bottomless, as if an entire army of the dead could be stored there. All the residents perked up and were glad that they would finally be freed and taken to a safe place where they could live in safety and not under the oppression of the state. The Shadow Clan member told his comrades to get ready and clear the road for the common people to avoid being attacked by monsters. The head of Kento was very angry that everything was not going according to his plan at all, and all the residents began to make their way through the enemy monsters to a safe place. Meanwhile, Kajuro called Sarah to help escort ordinary residents to the exit beyond the walls. Suddenly a monster appeared behind him and was about to attack Sarah. The monster quickly attacks, and the monster's hand is almost touching Sarah's hair, who very late notices that she is being attacked by a monster that she did not notice. Suddenly, Soma, who also fought and was nearby when the monster attacked the girl, comes to Sarah's aid. He manages to cut off the monster's hand so that he retreats or is killed by the sharp cleaver of the barber Soma. Uncle Soma grabs Sarah by the waist, seeing how she almost fell after being attacked by a monster that tried to kill her. Everything happened so quickly that Sarah did not have time to understand anything. The monster of the girl whose hand was cut off began to shout to the other monsters that it was getting too hot and the chances of winning were becoming less and less. Soma sees that the monsters have begun to retreat and leave the area through the destroyed wall. The monsters clearly did not expect such resistance and were not prepared for such resistance. Soma notices that he has been hugging Sarah for a long time and he feels embarrassed that this happened. He quickly tries to move away and apologize to the girl, to which Sarah began to laugh and say that everything is fine. Uncle Soma felt awkward after such a situation and he blushed with shame. He was a very strong warrior and still could not come to his senses and settle down after finding a girl. Suddenly Khan appears behind Uncle Soma, who notices that he is acting strangely, as if he really liked the girl Sarah, that he blushed so much. Soma was not taken aback and hit Khan on the head so that he would not say any heresy that could make him sentimental. Sarah, smiling, says that such a warrior really didn't get a girlfriend. Soma began to smile nervously and say that he traveled often and still didn't have time. What was happening was observed by the head of the absorbers, Kento, who was very angry that several absorbers were able to cope with such a large attack of monsters. While Kajuro was pretending to be wounded, the soldiers of the head of the absorbers ran up to him, who pointed their machine guns at the guy, keeping him at gunpoint. Kajuro stood up and was extremely surprised that machine guns were aimed at him, as if he were an enemy of the state. He began to guess that his presentation did not convince the head of honesty, but he did not have much evidence. Kajuro stood up at the soldier's orders and was handcuffed to prevent him from escaping. Kazuro listened to accusations that he was a traitor to his homeland. Kajuro began to make excuses that these were false accusations, and he was not going to help anyone. He also received wounds in a skirmish with a squad of shadows. The soldiers did not listen to the boy's stupid excuses and began to lead him into the car to take him to the ministry. The soldiers behind began to block Kajuro's comrades so that they would not interfere with the actions of the ministry absorbers. Before getting into the car, Kajuro turned around and told the guys confidently that the head of the absorbers did not have sufficient evidence and all the accusations were false, so he would soon be released. Kirizawa and his comrades were also surprised that the head of the absorbers decided to arrest Kajuro, who stood up to protect people and saved many while fighting off a crowd of monsters. Kirizawa was very annoyed and said in every possible way that this was wrong, and this should not be done to the savior of the country, that he fought with monsters while the head stood on the wall and watched. Kento is tired of listening to the conversations of the guys who came to Kazuro's defense. The head shouted to everyone that if they interfered with his affairs, they would also go with him for trying to interfere with the arrest. Kirizawa and his comrades calmed down and stopped shouting, but they continued to be very annoyed that the Ministry of Absorbers was behaving this way, after which the soldiers got into the car and drove towards the ministry, and the guys remained watching the car where they put them in the car. There was a lot going on in the Absorber's office. The employees were running around with a bunch of documents and could barely cope with the pile of cases that had appeared recently. The soldiers take Kazuro into the office, where there was such a rush that Kazuro decided to make fun of what was happening and said that they were having a good party here. After Kazuro's words, silence reigned in the office, which indicated an awkward situation where everyone was not happy with the guy's words. The head of the absorbers, Kento, kicked Kajuro to head to the interrogation room and stop talking to the employees. Kajuro continued to walk into the room and smiled, realizing that the head had nothing on him and would soon let him go. In the interrogation room, Kajuro was wearing bracelets that blocked all opportunities to control his monsters and be weakened. Kazuro was slightly surprised, but remembering the old movies about police officers that he had watched, Kazuro began to tell everything about himself that a person is obliged to say during interrogation. Kazuro introduced himself by his name, and that he was from a family of farmers who lived outside the city and had no connections with the absorbers. The head of the absorbers jumped up and hit the table, as if everything Kazuro said was a lie. Near the head sat two consultants who found out all the information about Kazuro and his family. The employees began to check Kazuro's data and tell the head that the boy was not lying, and everything that was written in his dossier was true. One of the consultants even added that they even found out where his parents got married and checked with a marriage agency, where everything was confirmed. This information was unnecessary and only made the head of Kento doubt the quality of his employees. Kazuro was absolutely sure that everything would work out for him, and he would definitely be acquitted. The head has no chance to imprison him for treason. Kento hit the table again and started yelling at Kajuro that he was so sure of his innocence. Kento began to say that he saw how Kajuro entered into a partnership with the Shadow Clan, which kidnapped all the inhabitants. Kazuro began to say that all this was not true, because he himself fought with shadows, which even left wounds on his body. Kento began to claim that this was nonsense and that the boy was clearly collaborating with the Shadow Clan. Kazuro behaved very calmly, realizing that there was absolutely no evidence of his conspiracy. Kento became very angry with Kajuro for acting so arrogantly. The head grabs the boy by the t-shirt, wanting to hit him and teach the impudent boy a lesson. Kento shouted at Kajuro and said that he was sure that the boy was going to go against the state and was guilty of collaborating with the Shadow Clan. Kazuro began shouting back at the head that he didn't understand what he was talking about and had nothing to do with the Shadow Clan at all. Kento looked at Kazuro with an angry gaze and said that he was sure that Kazuro was a traitor and that he was visiting Hanami's mother in the hospital. That woman is one of the main witches of the Shadow Village. Kazuro could barely restrain himself from laughing at what he heard. There wasn't even a thought in his head to think about who Hanami's mother was. Kajuro began to deny the head and say that he had no idea that the ex-wife of the head of Kento was a witch from the Shadow Clan. The fact that Kajuro found out that he was married to that woman was very unpleasant. Kento was filled with anger and a great desire to kill the guy. Kazuro behaved confidently and said that he just wanted to teach the head of the absorbers a lesson and cuckold him by sleeping with that woman. But it turned out that she was in bad condition after Kento brought her to a lying state. Kento was so angry that the boy knew about his relationship in the old years that he wanted to beat the guy badly so that he would talk less about what the head did 10 years ago. Kajuro was excited and provoked the head of Kento to beat him. Such behavior of the head may affect his status in the field of protecting the population. But Kento barely managed to restrain himself and lets the boy go, realizing that this is not worth risking his position in the service. But Kento didn't want to give up so easily and decides to roll up his sleeve to summon a monster and try to bring Kajuro out into the open. Kento summoned a monster with a pipe that was shrouded in tobacco smoke. This made Kazuro very tense, because then he might be exposed and find out what Kazuro was going to do. The girl began to hug the boy and breathe her tobacco smoke on him, telling him that now he would feel very good and he would tell him everything he knew. The employees who were in the interrogation room began to tell their head, Kento, that using the monster in interrogations is not legal, and if they find out about it, it will not end well. Suddenly, the head feels that a very angry person is entering their room who is extremely dissatisfied with this action of the head of the absorbers. The door to the interrogation room was knocked down and greatly surprised everyone who was in the room. Kento saw the man and was a little scared.